The ocean did not care whether he lived or died. It had swallowed better men whole, men with more strength, more hope, more reason to survive. It rolled beneath him in great gray swells, indifferent and ancient, stretching in every direction to the edge of the world. And yet, on a narrow rubber raft no longer than a man is tall, Second Lieutenant Harold Dixon of the United States Navy held on. He held on when the sun turned the sea into a mirror of fire. He held on when the nights brought a cold so deep it felt like the bones themselves were weeping. He held on for 47 days. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about what happens when a human being refuses, against every possible reason, to stop. It was January 16, 1942. The war was barely 6 weeks old for the United States, and already the Pacific had become a graveyard. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had shattered the myth of American invulnerability and sent the entire Pacific Fleet scrambling to rebuild, regroup, and fight back with whatever it had left. Carrier task forces were being assembled, scout missions were being launched daily, and naval aviators were being asked to fly longer, harder, and farther than any training manual had ever prepared them for. Aboard the USS Enterprise, one of the few carriers to survive Pearl Harbor intact, the men of Torpedo Squadron 6 were among the most experienced naval aviators in the fleet. They had trained for years for exactly this kind of war. But training and combat are two entirely different animals, and the Pacific Ocean in those first weeks of 1942 was making that distinction with brutal clarity. Harold Dixon was the squadron's navigation officer, a veteran airman with thousands of hours of flight time and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having done something well for a very long time. On the morning of January 16th, he led a scouting mission in a TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, a large, slow, dependable aircraft that the Navy had built for carrier operations. With him were aviation machinist's mate Second Class Tony Pastula, his radio man, and aviation ordnanceman Third Class Gene Aldrich, his gunner. 3 men, 1 plane, a vast and indifferent ocean below them. The mission was routine, or as routine as anything could be in wartime. They were to range out ahead of the task force, scanning the sea for Japanese ships. The Devastator droned on through the morning sky, the blue water below them broken occasionally by whitecaps and the long, rolling swells of the open Pacific. Hours passed. The horizon remained empty. And then, the engine began to lose power. It was subtle at first, a slight roughness in the sound, a faint shudder through the airframe that Dixon felt more in his stomach than his hands. He scanned the instruments. The fuel gauges told the story. A combination of longer-than-planned flight time and a miscalculation in fuel consumption had brought them to a catastrophic moment. They were far from the carrier, far from any land, and the engine was dying. Dixon made the calls he had to make. He radioed his position, or what he believed his position to be, and prepared for a water landing, a ditching in the language of naval aviation. He brought the Devastator down as smoothly as he could, flaring at the last moment, the big plane settling onto the surface of the Pacific with a violent shudder and a wall of white spray. The impact was savage. The aircraft nosed forward, the cockpit taking on water almost immediately, and the 3 men had perhaps 60 seconds to get clear before the plane went under. They made it out. They had their emergency raft, a small rubber life raft designed for exactly this kind of situation. They had no food, they had no fresh water. They had 1 small knife, 1 pair of pliers, and the clothes on their backs. They were somewhere in the vast central Pacific, and the Enterprise was already steaming away, its task force unable to mount a search in wartime waters. The rescue never came. They waited through the first day, and the second, and the third. The sky remained empty. The sea remained empty. By the 4th day, it was clear to Harold Dixon that no one was coming. Whatever survival they were going to achieve, they were going to achieve themselves. Dixon took command of the raft the way he had taken command of his aircraft, calmly, methodically, and with absolute focus on the task at hand. He established routines. They would watch in shifts so that no one fell into the sea during the night. They would conserve energy during the heat of the day. They would not panic. He said this more than once in those early days, and the men around him heard something in his voice that was not performance. Harold Dixon genuinely believed they could survive, and that belief, communicated without drama or false comfort, became the invisible structure that held the three men together. But belief alone could not feed three men on an open ocean. By the end of the first week, hunger had moved from discomfort to something more serious. The body begins to turn on itself in a precise and merciless sequence when food is withheld. First, the fat reserves, then the muscle tissue, then the deeper structures of the body begin to break down. The men grew weaker, their lips cracked, their eyes sank into their skulls. The sun was relentless, burning the exposed skin on their faces and hands until it peeled and bled, then burning the new skin beneath. Dixon watched the water around them. He was a man who had spent years learning to observe. A navigator must observe, must read the sky and the sea and the subtle patterns that other men miss. He watched the birds that occasionally wheeled above the raft, and he understood that birds meant fish. He improvised a fish hook from the pliers, bending the metal into a crude curve and using strips of clothing as line. He caught small fish. They ate them raw, the flesh gray and tasteless, but alive with the moisture and calories that were keeping their organs functioning. Rain was everything. When it came, they spread whatever fabric they had to collect it, drinking greedily, filling whatever containers they could improvise. When it didn't come, the thirst became a physical force, a pressure behind the eyes, a constant low roar in the mind. Dixon had read accounts of men at sea, lost without water, who had been driven to drink the ocean. He had briefed his crew on why that would kill them. The salt would accelerate dehydration, triggering a catastrophic cascade that could turn a man mad within hours. He kept his men from the sea. There were sharks. This was the Pacific, and the sharks were always there, circling with the unhurried patience of creatures that had no reason to rush. They bumped the raft periodically, testing it. Dixon used the knife. He struck at them when they came too close, sharp, hard blows to the snout, and the sharks retreated, not permanently, but temporarily, which was enough. He kept the knife ready at all times. The days accumulated with the weight of stones. Each sunrise brought a renewal of hope and a renewal of suffering in equal measure. The men talked less as the weeks passed, not from despair, but from the simple conservation of energy. Words cost something out here. Dixon kept the routines, watches, fishing, watching the sky, navigating by the stars at night, working out in his head where the trade winds and the ocean currents were carrying them, maintaining a mental chart of their probable position. By the third week, Gene Aldrich had developed sores on his legs that would not heal. The combination of salt water, sun, and malnutrition had compromised his body's ability to repair itself. Dixon cleaned the wounds with careful hands, tearing strips of his own shirt when they ran out of other cloth. Tony Pastula had grown so thin that his face looked carved, the bones sharp beneath the skin, but his eyes remained clear. He prayed. Dixon did not discourage it. There were moments of grace, small and improbable. A school of dolphins passed close enough to touch, their sleek bodies a reminder that the world beneath the raft was full of life, indifferent to the suffering above it, but beautiful nonetheless. One evening, as the sun went down in a spectacle of orange and red that no painter could have reproduced, the three men sat together in the raft and said nothing for a long time because there was nothing that needed to be said in the face of that much beauty. On the 28th day, they saw land. It was a smear on the horizon, barely distinguishable from cloud, but Dixon had been watching the sky and the water long enough to know the difference. He calculated their position, working from star sights and current estimates, and concluded that they were somewhere near the northern Cook Islands. He began to paddle. All three men paddled, using their hands and a fragment of aluminum they had salvaged from their flight suits, and the current helped them. And slowly, with agonizing slowness, the smear on the horizon grew into an island. But they could not reach it. The currents shifted and they were carried past, close enough to see trees and breaking surf, but unable to close the distance. The island slid past and disappeared behind them. Dixon watched it go with a face that revealed nothing. He continued to paddle. The 34th day brought a storm that lasted 2 days and nights, waves lifting the tiny raft and dropping it with a violence that seemed designed to break the last of their spirits. The 3 men lashed themselves to the raft and held on through the darkness and the screaming wind, and in the morning they were still there, still alive, battered and exhausted and raw, but alive. On the 47th day, the island of Puka Puka appeared. It was a small atoll in the Cook Islands, barely a dot on any map, inhabited by a small community whose ancestors had been navigating this ocean for 2,000 years before any Western sailor had laid eyes on it. The people of Puka Puka saw the raft drifting toward their shore and came out in their canoes to meet it, and what they found was almost beyond comprehension. 3 American naval officers, skeletal, sunburned to the point of open wounds, barely conscious, but alive. Harold Dixon had lost more than 40 pounds. Gene Aldrich and Tony Pastula were in similarly devastating physical condition. They had been adrift for 47 days, covering more than 1,000 miles of open ocean, surviving on raw fish and rainwater, held together by discipline and stubbornness and the unwillingness of one man to accept the verdict the ocean had passed on them. The people of Puka Puka cared for them with extraordinary kindness, feeding them gently. Dixon understood enough about starvation recovery to warn against eating too much too soon, and tending their wounds and sheltering them until a rescue vessel could be arranged. The 3 men spent 2 weeks recovering before they were transported back to the fleet. Harold Dixon received the Navy Cross. The citation spoke of exceptional fortitude and courageous leadership, the formal language of military honors that never quite captures what it is describing. What Dixon had done was simpler and larger than any citation could express. He had refused to let his men die. He had refused to let himself die. In a situation where the vast majority of men would have surrendered to despair within the first week, he had built a structure of routine and discipline and maintained it for 47 days across 1,000 miles of open ocean. He kept going. Tony Pastula and Gene Aldrich came home because Harold Dixon decided every single day for 47 days that they were going to survive. That decision, repeated in the darkness and the heat and the thirst and the hunger and the loneliness, is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the essential thing, the thing that military training and military honors and military history all point toward, but rarely capture cleanly. The ocean was indifferent. It rolled beneath them in its great gray swells and cared nothing about what happened on the surface. But Harold Dixon was not indifferent. He cared with every cell of his diminishing body, every hour of every day, through storms and calms and the slow dissolution of everything but the core of who he was. And in the end, after 47 days, the ocean gave them back. Not because it had mercy, not because the odds finally bent in their favor, but because Harold Dixon would not let them have them. He held on. He held on until the island appeared and the canoes came out and the long nightmare finally, impossibly, ended. He held on because that is what leaders do. That is what soldiers do. That is what human beings do when they are at their absolute best in the worst moments the world can produce. He held on, and they came home.